Well, I'm excited to be able to bring you the word today. Today we're going to be in Daniel. So if you have your Bibles and you want to open up to Daniel, we're going to start off in chapter 1, and then we're going to jump quickly to our section for today, and that's in chapter 6. So if you've been joining us this past year, we have been on this journey through the essential 50 stories of the Old Testament. And as we've been on this journey, we followed the nation of Israel. We've seen them at their founding in the desert, through God giving them land. We've seen some kings come. We've seen some kings go, some of them honoring God. But as we saw, most of the kings actually went totally against what God had established. And throughout this time, as we've been reading, one of the things that I've been reminded, and I hope that you've been reminded as well, is of God's sovereignty. And if you don't understand what that word means, it simply means that God is ultimately in charge. And so, in this passage, when we find Israel being disobedient to God, God actually uses other nations to go to war to Israel to bring about their discipline. And in this case that we find in Daniel, God uses the Babylonians to do that. Take a look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And it says this: "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." Notice in this passage that it was the Lord who delivered the king of Judah into the hands of Babylon. Now, if you don't know what's going on with the Babylonians, a lot of times with war, one of the things that we think would happen is that the people would just go through. They would have this war. They would kill all the men. They would take all the women to be their own. That's one of the ways that people would try to conquer the world back in ancient times. But the Babylonians were a little bit different. The Babylonians, what they would do is they would go in, they would conquer the land, but then they would let everybody kind of live and do their own thing, except for the best of the best. The best of the best, they would take them and they would bring them back to the king. And you find that here in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. It says, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the king of his court officials, to bring into the court service, or the king's service, some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter into the king's service." You see, the goal of this was to take the best of the best people and to actually change their worldview. To change their worldview into a group of people that were trained in the ways of the Babylonians. And then after that, they would either serve the king there in Babylon, or they would actually take them and reintroduce them back into their homeland to take the culture of the Babylonians and spread it around back in their home region. Well, in Daniel chapter 6 that we're going to look at today, we have the conclusion of the narrative section of the book of Daniel. There's several stories that go on, and they're great stories, and many of you know the stories, and you probably know the story that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But this kingdom that we have, that we find here in Daniel chapter 6, the kingdom has been taken over by a man named Darius the Mede. Now, just as a short history lesson, we don't actually know, other than in the Bible, we don't actually know, we don't see King Darius showing up outside of biblical history. Some scholars believe that's because he was just a local governor, and he wasn't actually a king. However, others actually believe that this was the name that was used for Cyrus, another king that you can read about here in Daniel as well. So we have this man named Daniel. And he's taken into captivity. He's moved away from his family and his home when he was a teenager. And when we find him here in chapter 6, Daniel's no longer a teenager. He's about 70 years old. Now, I know that for many of us, if we're like, listen, if I'm healthy at 70, I'm going to retire, I'm going to get a boat, I'm going to go fishing every day, I'm going to watch my shows, I'm going to garden, and just people can leave me alone. Maybe that's some of our goals in life. But I want to share with you something that I discovered this week. Newman Darlin is a scholar of accepted standing, and he made an analysis of the lives and all the achievements of 400 people that are the foremost characters in history. In that analysis, it showed that nearly 80 of the world's greatest figures close active lives between 58 and 80. Bye. Young life is a blessing of a church. I'll tell you this, you want that in your church. You want to hear those things in your church because that means that there's young people that are being brought up in the ways of the Lord. I love it. I absolutely love it. So Newman Darlin, he shared this study, and it said that 80 of the world's greatest figures close active lives between the age of 58 and 80. 25% continued to have an active life beyond 70. 22.5% beyond the age of 80. And 6% beyond the age of 90. I want you to consider what men have done, what people have done beyond the age of 80. When 83, Gladstone, for the 4th time, became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Michelangelo, at the age of 89, he executed his Last Judgment, perhaps his most famous piece of art that ever existed. John Wesley preached with almost undiminished eloquence at the age of 88. Closing that remarkable age, it's one of the most remarkable careers of his time. He traveled over 250,000 miles in an age that knew not electricity or steam for travel. And he delivered some estimated 4,000 sermons and wrote volumes and volumes of books. Edison was inventing at the age of 90. Wright at 90 was considered a creative architect. Shaw was writing plays at 90. Grandma Moses was painting at 80. And J.C. Penney, the great Christian, was working strenuously at his desk at the age of 95. And here, we find Daniel at post-retirement age. And he's serving. And he's not just serving, but look what it says in Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." Now Daniel, for over 50 years, he's been serving in an empire that has different values than his own. And he's been doing so at such a level that this ruler wants to make him one of the top 3 leaders over the entire kingdom of Babylon. And as he's going about doing that, he so distinguishes himself in serving the king that the king's new plan is to make him, except for the king, he's ruler over the whole kingdom. And then look what happens. It's amazing what happens when God figures out ways to promote us to places and to put us in areas where we have influence. Look what happens to Daniel next in verse 4. It says this, "At this, when the king decided all this," it says, "at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs." I want to give you a life lesson today. And this isn't really, a message point, but this applies to us all. So if you showed up here today and you're wondering, like, I'm not really sure about Jesus. I don't really know if I've put my faith in Jesus, and you just showed up today and you're just on this journey trying to figure out what you do believe. First off, I just want to welcome you here today. Here we're just a bunch of people who have experienced the grace of Jesus. We're not perfect, but we understand that Jesus died on a cross in our place. We aren't perfect. We're just beggars who know where the bread of life is. And so we too are on this journey of allowing God to work in our lives. And so if you're here today and you're just like, man, or maybe you're watching online and you're not really sure about who God is, I want to give you a life lesson that you can take home today, whether you're a Christian or not. It's this, and it's found in Daniel. No matter what your age, if you remain focused in doing things to the best of your ability, don't be surprised when people see you, get jealous, and attack you. Here, these people, they're not really interested in hurting Daniel. But what they are interested in doing is eliminating his leadership. And they're willing to hurt Daniel if it eliminates his leadership. And so I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that every attack that comes your way because you're so faithful and you're diligent. But faithfulness and diligence don't exclude you from personal attacks. But here's what we tend to do as Christians even. As Christians, we go through something and we say, but God, why me? I mean, God, I've been doing everything right. And God says, I know. God, I've placed my trust in you. I'm trying to follow you to the best of my abilities. And God says, I know. God, I've been trying to live my life just like Jesus. And I've been asking you to make me more like Jesus. And God says, what happened to Jesus? He was completely righteous, completely faithful, and he was misunderstood. He was attacked, he was persecuted, and he was killed. Maybe when we face personal attacks, we should, number one, evaluate our life and ask if there's anything that we're doing wrong in our life, any sinful behavior that would cause us to experience this. But after that, well, I'll say this. I know in my life, a lot of the persecution and a lot of the frustration that happens in my life, it happens because of my own stupidity. It happens because I made mistakes, because I committed sin. That's where a lot of the rough stuff that happens in my life. But there have also been times that it's not because of that. But when we search our hearts and we know that persecution is coming because of our faithfulness, we should be reminded what Jesus teaches in Matthew. If you see what he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 11, it says this, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Look what Scripture says in James chapter 1, verse 12. It says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him." And that is exactly what's going on here in Daniel. He's been faithful, he's been doing the right things, and yet there's persecution that's coming. Look what it says again in verse 4. Daniel chapter 6, verse 4. It says, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, 'We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" So these people, they get together and they say, if we're going to get rid of Daniel, if we're going to stop him, it's going to have to be about his worship of God. So they create a scheme that no one is allowed to pray to any god besides the king himself for 30 days. Now here's where Daniel, I think, has a ton to offer us today. He's in a world where things are going against his faith. You ever see that in our world today? But what is Daniel's response? He does everything he can to abide by the laws until it impacts his faith. And when it does, he opens up a Facebook account and he starts posting all kinds of stuff in protest saying, "This is why I can't stand our government." That's not what he does. Daniel goes about his life doing the things that he's always done. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, they weren't allowed to worship, they weren't allowed to pray to anyone except for the king, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." You see, Daniel's not being a jerk. Daniel's being steady. I'm going to do what I've always done. You're telling me that I can't pray. I'm going to continue praying like I've always done. Some of us, if they started banning prayer in restaurants, there'd be plenty of people who would be furious. But let's face it, not many of us pray at restaurants anyway. Just keeping it real. If they ban prayer from school at the lunchroom table, and you're like, "I've got to fight for my right," the question is do you pray at the school lunch table now? Daniel isn't about protesting. He's about doing the right things that he's always been doing. Daniel is steady. My encouragement for you today, in a world that is chaotic, in a world that is full of ups and downs and extremes, is to be steady. Daniel's not trying to break the laws. He's honoring the laws in every way that he can, but he's steady. And look what happens. This group of people, they see Daniel praying like this, just as he always does, and they go to the king. Daniel chapter 6, verse 13. It says this, "Then they said to the king, 'Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.' When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, 'Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed.' So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God whom you serve continually rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried into the lion's den. When he came near, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?' And Daniel answered, 'May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouth of the lions, and they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty.' The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God." Now, this is the part of the story that most of you know. And I love this story. One of the things that I found interesting as I was preparing to speak to you was the king. The king's reaction to all of this is a little surprising. You see, the king has everything that the world has to offer. The king has everything. He has all the praise of the people. He has the palace and all of the pleasures. He has the popularity. But when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, the one thing that he doesn't have is peace. The one thing he doesn't have is peace. And he doesn't have peace because he doesn't have the presence of God. Peace is found in the presence of God. Some of you are here today, and you've been chasing all that the world has to offer. Maybe you've chased it, and maybe you've even achieved it. And everything that was supposed to come with the bigger business, the successful children, the bigger house, the nicer car, and you still find yourself empty. I will tell you this: until your entire faith is placed in Jesus Christ, you will never have the peace that God has to offer you. Until your entire faith is placed in Jesus Christ, you will never have the peace that God has to offer you. There's something else going on here, though. In the next verse, in verse 24, it says this: At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And the Bible is a rated R book sometimes. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. Look what happened to the men who plotted against Daniel. They were destroyed. Listen, if you're like Daniel and your faith has been placed in God and your character is like his, trustworthy and never corrupt, never negligent, the people that attack you falsely will receive judgment as well. Some of you are excited and you're like, I just found a new way of expressing my anger. This is going to be good. Like, to the lion's den. I don't even have to say a cuss word, Like, to the lion's den with you. That's not what I'm talking about. But I want to tell you this, that if you're living a life of faithfulness, God sees you. He sees you. He sees your perseverance. He knows what's being said about you. And he knows if they're lies or if they're truth. And those people may never answer here on earth to the things that they're causing pain, for the things that are causing pain in your life. They may never answer to that here on earth. But they will answer to God. And so our response, knowing that they will answer to God, is to not jump up and down and shout for joy. Our response is to the people that hurt us is to love them and to pray for them. And to set an example of how Jesus would live and how Jesus would love them. That's the way that we should treat our enemies. We don't hope for their downfall. We trust God no matter what. I want us to look at another thing here today. As I was doing some research, I found out about a situation here that I was unaware of. I didn't realize that Daniel chapter 6, the Israelites had quite possibly already been released from captivity. That they had already gone back. It didn't occur to me as I've read through Daniel. It just wasn't part of the story that I knew growing up. Daniel had an option. Daniel could have gone back home. Daniel could have said, you know what, this king, he's not going to let me worship. I'm packing up. I'm going back to Israel. He had that opportunity. Instead, we find Daniel being steady, continuing to serve. Why would he do that? I'm glad you asked that question. Because it tells us here in Daniel chapter 6, verse 25, it says this. Look what happens with King Darius. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples, every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The king is now praising the God of Daniel. Maybe you're here today and you're wondering why God is allowing you to go through all these things. Well, maybe it isn't about you. Maybe your faithfulness during these times of suffering is to point someone else to Jesus. Maybe the only way that they will ever know about the greatness of Jesus is that you would be a person of faithfulness, no corruption, trustworthy, and not negligent, living in a kingdom that you don't even agree with their worldview. But you just shine like Jesus. They see these things in you. They see you suffering and suffering with joy. They see that your eyes remain on Jesus even when things are crazy in your life, that you stay focused on Him. Maybe the thing that you're experiencing, it's not about you, it's about you pointing others to Jesus. They see these things and it causes them to look at who your God is. Look at what Isaiah chapter 55 says. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. It says this. I don't like this sometimes, but it's true. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God, I don't understand. I don't understand why you're putting me through this. I mean, you have the power to change this, and you're not doing it. Well, Josh, maybe it's not about you. Maybe I just need you to be steady. I don't need you to take up arms and protest. I just need you to keep doing the things that you've always been doing, seeking after me. And trust me. Trust me that I'm in charge of everything and I know what I'm doing. It may not make sense here. It may not make sense till you get to heaven. But just keep being steady and trusting in the Lord. He knows what He's doing. He has a plan. And He will use you in it if you will continue to be faithful and diligent like Daniel was. Will you stand with me? Lord, we love you so much. Lord, we thank you that you're a God who keeps calling people. Lord, you're a God who, when it comes to ministry, you don't know retirement. It's just being steady, keep serving you, keep following you, keep shining a light, keep being steady. That's what we find in Daniel.